The sky above Ostersleben, Germany, on the 20th of February, 1944, was a pale winter gray. At 11,000 meters, the temperature hung at 40 degrees below zero. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock of Jagdgeschwader 11 pulled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a climbing turn, his eyes tracking the contrails of American heavy bombers streaming toward Brunswick. He'd seen this formation before, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses arranged in their defensive boxes, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns. But something was different this morning. Something that made his throat tighten even before his radio crackled to life. Achtung! Amerikanische Jäger. 3 o'clock level. Nock's head snapped right. There, silhouetted against the cloud layer, were aircraft unlike any escort fighters he'd encountered before. Not the stubby Thunderbolts that usually turned back at the German border. Not the twin-boom Lightnings with their limited range. These were sleek, shark-like single-engine fighters with distinctive bubble canopies and laminar flow wings. And they were here. Deep over Germany. Hundreds of kilometers from their bases in England. In that moment, watching those silver fighters weave through the bomber string with an ease that shouldn't have been possible, Heinz Nock understood something that would take the German high command months to fully accept: the air war over Europe had fundamentally changed. The Americans had solved the unsolvable problem. They had built a fighter that could escort their bombers all the way to Berlin and back. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The aircraft Nock was staring at was the North American P-51 Mustang, and within 6 months, it would break the back of the Luftwaffe. But to understand what German fighter pilots really thought when they encountered this machine, to grasp the psychological earthquake it caused, we must first understand what they believed about themselves, their aircraft, and the supposed impossibility of what they were witnessing. In the autumn of 1943, the Jagdwaffe, the fighter arm of the Luftwaffe, still considered itself the most formidable air force in the world. This wasn't mere propaganda or delusion. It was based on 5 years of combat experience that seemed to validate German superiority in nearly every measurable category. The average Luftwaffe fighter pilot entering combat in late 1943 had accumulated between 200 and 240 hours of flight training. This was significantly more than his Allied counterparts. American pilots were entering combat with as few as 200 hours total flight time, often with less than 20 hours in their assigned fighter type. The Germans trained their pilots on multiple aircraft types, emphasized aerobatic skill, and required demonstrated proficiency in instrument flying and advanced tactics before combat assignment. More critically, the Luftwaffe's veteran pilots possessed something that couldn't be taught in any training program: extensive combat experience. Men like Major Gunther Röhl, who by December 1943 had shot down 222 enemy aircraft. Or Hauptmann Hans-Joachim Marseille, who before his death in September 1942 had destroyed 158 Allied planes. These weren't isolated examples. The Luftwaffe maintained a corps of highly experienced expert aces, who had survived years of continuous combat across multiple theaters. Their aircraft, while aging, remained competitive. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 Gustav, the workhorse of the Jagdwaffe in 1943, could reach speeds of 650 km per hour and climb to 10,000 meters in under 6 minutes. Its 20mm cannon and twin 13mm machine guns delivered devastating firepower. The newer Focke-Wulf FW-190 Anton, which had entered service in 1941, was considered by many pilots superior to anything the Allies could field, faster than the Spitfire Mark V at low altitude, more heavily armed, and capable of absorbing tremendous punishment. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine had been forged in the crucible of the Spanish Civil War and refined through the campaigns in Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. German fighter pilots understood energy fighting, the importance of altitude advantage, and the devastating effectiveness of the high-speed diving attack. They fought in mutually supporting pairs, the Rot, with a leader and wingman, a system that every other air force eventually copied because of its superiority to the rigid Vic formations the Allies initially employed. But most importantly, throughout 1943, the Luftwaffe seemed to be winning the air battle over Germany itself. When the United States 8th Air Force attempted its first deep penetration raid against Schweinfurt and Regensburg on the 17th of August, 1943, German fighters had mauled the attacking force. Of 376 bombers dispatched, 60 were shot down and many more damaged beyond repair. A second Schweinfurt raid on the 14th of October, which would become known as Black Thursday in American bomber crew accounts, resulted in 77 heavy bombers destroyed and 121 damaged. Nearly 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single day. These were unsustainable losses. The mathematics were simple and brutal. If the Americans lost 10% of their attacking force on every mission, they would run out of crews long before Germany ran out of factories. General Adolf Galland, the general of fighters and one of the most experienced combat pilots in the Luftwaffe, could look at these numbers and conclude that the American daylight bombing campaign was approaching collapse. The limiting factor, both sides understood, was fighter escort range. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, which equipped most American fighter groups in 1943, was a formidable aircraft, fast, heavily armed, and capable of absorbing tremendous battle damage. But its range, even with drop tanks, extended only to the German border. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning could reach slightly deeper into Germany, but its distinctive twin-boom configuration made it easily identifiable, and Luftwaffe pilots had learned its weaknesses. It could be outmaneuvered by the 109 and 190 in turning combat, and its turbochargers were prone to failure in the extreme cold of high-altitude flight over northern Europe. This created what the Germans called the Reichsverteidigung Zone, the Reich Defense Zone, a corridor of German airspace where American bombers flew without fighter protection. In this zone, Luftwaffe fighters could attack at will, focusing on the most vulnerable bombers, using tactics that maximized their advantages while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. They attacked head-on, where the bomber's defensive armament was weakest. They concentrated fire on the lead aircraft, disrupting formation integrity. They called in the bomber's stream's position, altitude, and heading to flak batteries, creating a coordinated defense that extracted a terrible price. The prevailing belief within the Jagdwaffe was straightforward: American industrial might could produce endless bombers, but it couldn't overcome the fundamental physics of fighter escort range. No single-engine fighter could carry enough fuel to escort bombers deep into Germany and still retain sufficient performance to fight effectively. The mathematics of weight, drag, and fuel consumption seemed immutable. Every additional kilogram of fuel meant reduced maneuverability, slower acceleration, lower service ceiling. A fighter designed for long range would inevitably sacrifice the performance characteristics necessary for air combat. This belief was reinforced by Germany's own experience. The Luftwaffe had attempted to develop long-range escort fighters and consistently found that the compromises required larger airframes, heavier fuel loads, reduced power-to-weight ratios, produced aircraft that were vulnerable in combat. The Messerschmitt Bf 110 Zerstorer, initially designed as a long-range escort fighter, had proven too sluggish and unmaneuverable to survive against single-engine opponents. It had been relegated to night fighting and ground attack roles. Therefore, the Luftwaffe's strategic calculation in late 1943 appeared sound: continue inflicting unsustainable losses on unescorted bomber formations, and the Americans would be forced to abandon daylight precision bombing. Germany's war industries would survive, V-weapon production would continue, and the Wehrmacht would have the equipment needed to defend Fortress Europe. What German intelligence had failed to adequately assess, what seemed too improbable to take seriously, was a peculiar hybrid aircraft that had been flying in small numbers since late 1943. An American fighter with a British heart. A design that somehow delivered both the range to escort bombers to Berlin and the performance to dominate German fighters in combat. The North American P-51 Mustang's development history was itself a kind of accident, a convergence of desperate need, engineering innovation, and bureaucratic circumvention that produced an aircraft whose capabilities seemed to violate the accepted rules of fighter design. In April 1940, with the Battle of France collapsing and Britain facing potential invasion, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation with an unusual request. Britain needed fighters, thousands of them, but American production was already committed to existing designs. Could North American design and build an entirely new fighter aircraft in 120 days? The proposal seemed absurd. Fighter development typically required years of iterative design, prototype testing, and refinement. But North American's vice president and chief engineer, James Dutch Kindleberger, and his lead designer, Edgar Schmud, believed they could do it. They had been studying fighter design intensively, examining the lessons from Europe's air war, analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of existing types. They had ideas about laminar flow wings, streamlined fuselages, and efficient cooling systems that they believed could produce superior performance. 117 days later, on the 26th of October, 1940, the prototype NA-73 took its first flight. It was designated the Mustang Mark I by the Royal Air Force, which ordered an initial batch of 320 aircraft. The early Mustang was fast, remarkably fast at low altitude, but its Allison V1710 engine lost power rapidly above 15,000 feet. This made it unsuitable for the high-altitude bomber escort role. The RAF relegated most Mustangs to tactical reconnaissance and ground attack missions, where the aircraft's speed, range, and excellent low-altitude performance proved valuable but not revolutionary. The transformation came from an almost casual suggestion. In April 1942, Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew a Mustang Mark I at the RAF's Duxford Airfield. He was impressed by the airframe's efficiency and handling characteristics, but noted the altitude limitation. Harker immediately recognized that the Mustang's exceptional aerodynamics combined with Rolls-Royce's Merlin 61 engine, the same power plant that had transformed the Spitfire, could produce something extraordinary. The Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 incorporated a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained power output at altitudes above 30,000 feet. It produced 1,460 horsepower at takeoff and could sustain over 1,000 horsepower at 25,000 feet. When installed in the Mustang's sleek airframe, with its laminar flow wing and efficient cooling system, the combination produced performance that astonished even the test pilots. The Mustang Mark X, designated P-51B in American service, could reach speeds of 700 km per hour at 25,000 feet. It could climb to 30,000 feet in under 8 minutes. Its service ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet. But the truly revolutionary capability was range. With two 75-gallon drop tanks, a P-51 could fly over 2,500 kilometers. It could take off from bases in England, escort bombers to Berlin, engage in sustained combat over the target, and return home with fuel reserves. No other fighter in operational service anywhere in the world in early 1944 could match this combination of range, speed, altitude performance, and maneuverability. The Mustang wasn't just incrementally better than existing fighters, it represented a paradigm shift in what was possible. The aircraft's armament complemented its performance. The P-51B carried 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, with 400 rounds per gun for the inboard weapons and 270 rounds for the outboard guns. This was less total firepower than the P-47 Thunderbolt's 850 calibers, but the Mustang's superior maneuverability meant pilots could bring guns to bear more effectively. The 50 caliber Browning, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds at a rate of 800 rounds per minute, could tear through aluminum skin, sever control cables, rupture fuel tanks, and destroy engines at ranges exceeding 800 meters. But specifications on paper couldn't convey what it was like to fly the Mustang or, more critically, what it was like to fight against it. That understanding would come only through combat, through the desperate encounters in the winter and spring of 1944 when Luftwaffe pilots encountered this new fighter and realized that every assumption they'd held about the air war had become obsolete. The P-51 Mustang entered combat over Europe in significant numbers in December 1943, but its impact wasn't immediately apparent. The 8th Air Force had received Mustangs before, the earlier A and B models with Allison engines, but these had been used primarily for tactical reconnaissance. The Merlin-powered B and C models arrived in England gradually through late 1943, equipping the 354th and 357th Fighter Groups initially. The first major encounter came during the 8th Air Force's campaign against German aircraft production facilities in late February 1944, a week-long series of raids the Americans codenamed Big Week. On the 20th of February, the date of Heinz Noakes' encounter over Ostersleben, over 1,000 American heavy bombers attacked 12 aircraft factories across Germany, escorted by a fighter force that included P-51s for the first time in strength. Major Gunther Rall, who survived the war with 275 confirmed aerial victories, later described his first encounter with Mustangs in an interview conducted in the 1980s. "We saw them coming from a long way off, and at first, we thought they might be 109s. The silhouette was similar, single-engine, inline cooling, bubble canopy on the later versions. But they were too far east. No German fighter would be that far from base without drop tanks, and these aircraft were clearly ready to fight. When they turned toward us, I realized what they were, and I knew immediately that we had a serious problem." The problem was multifaceted. First, the Mustangs' presence over deep German territory meant American bombers were no longer vulnerable in the Reichsverteidigung zone. The hunting ground that had allowed Luftwaffe pilots to attack with relative impunity had vanished. Every bomber formation now had escort capable of engaging German fighters on equal or better terms. Second, the P-51's performance envelope overlapped almost perfectly with the Bf-109 and FW-190. In the horizontal turning fight, the Mustang could match or exceed both German types. In vertical maneuvers, climbs, dives, and zoom climbs, the Mustang's power-to-weight ratio gave it advantages. At altitude above 25,000 feet, where much of the combat occurred, the Merlin-powered Mustang actually outperformed the Daimler-Benz DB605-powered 109 Gustav. Third, and perhaps most psychologically devastating, the Mustang was often flown by aggressive pilots employing offensive tactics. Unlike the earlier escort fighters, which had been tied closely to the bomber formations, P-51 units began implementing a more fluid strategy. Some Mustangs stayed close to the bombers as direct escort, but others operated as freelance fighters, actively hunting Luftwaffe formations before they could reach the bomber stream. Heinz Noakes' combat report from the 20th of February recorded the encounter with clinical precision. At 1100 hours, while climbing to intercept the enemy bomber formation, my Schwarm was engaged by American P-51 fighters east of Ostersleben. The enemy aircraft demonstrated superior speed and climb rate. I managed one deflection shot at a Mustang passing through my formation but observed no hits. My wingman, Unteroffizier Muller, was shot down. I observed his aircraft trailing smoke and glycol. He bailed out, but I cannot confirm his survival. I evaded 3 attacking P-51s by diving through cloud layer and returned to base with minimal fuel remaining. The language was matter-of-fact, standard for German combat reports, but the subtext was clear. Noakes' unit had been bounced, had lost an aircraft without claiming any victories, and had been forced to disengage without ever reaching the bombers they'd been sent to intercept. This was not how air combat over Germany was supposed to proceed. As February turned to March in 1944, the pattern repeated with increasing frequency. On the 6th of March, 8th Air Force mounted its first major raid on Berlin, the German capital that Hitler had boasted would never be bombed. 730 bombers attacked Berlin's industrial districts, escorted by nearly 700 fighters, including more than 200 P-51s. The psychological impact of American fighters over Berlin itself, over 1,100 kilometers from their bases in England, shattered German assumptions about what was possible. Johannes Steinhoff, who would end the war as one of the Luftwaffe's most highly decorated pilots with 176 confirmed victories, was flying with Jagerschwader 7 on the 6th of March. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "The appearance of the P-51 Mustang changed everything. Before, we could see the American escorts turn back at the border, and we knew we had perhaps 30 minutes to work against the bombers without fighter interference. Suddenly, the escorts were with the bombers all the way to the target and all the way home. And they weren't just defending, they were hunting us. It became clear very quickly that we were now fighting a defensive battle in our own sky." The defensive nature of the Luftwaffe's new position manifested in concrete, measurable ways. In January 1944, before Mustangs appeared in strength, the Luftwaffe was shooting down American bombers at a rate that approached 8% per mission, unsustainable for the Americans. By April 1944, with P-51s providing comprehensive escort, bomber loss rates had dropped to less than 4%, and were continuing to decline. Simultaneously, Luftwaffe fighter losses were climbing dramatically. The mathematics that had seemed to favor Germany just months earlier had inverted. Now it was the Jagdwaffe bleeding pilots and aircraft at a rate that couldn't be sustained. The training pipeline that had once produced highly skilled pilots was collapsing under the dual pressures of fuel shortages and compressed training schedules. By mid-1944, new Luftwaffe pilots were entering combat with as few as 130 hours total flight time, half what their predecessors had received, and often with less than 20 hours in the aircraft they would fly in combat. Meanwhile, American pilot quality was improving. Early war USAF fighter pilots had often been hastily trained and tactically naive, easy targets for experienced German veterans. But by spring 1944, American pilots were receiving better training, benefiting from combat lessons learned at terrible cost in 1943, and flying an aircraft that gave them advantages in nearly every phase of combat. What made the P-51 Mustang particularly devastating wasn't just its performance, it was the timing of its arrival and what it represented psychologically to Luftwaffe pilots who were already under enormous strain. By early 1944, Germany's strategic position had deteriorated drastically from the high water mark of 1942. The Wehrmacht had been defeated at Stalingrad and was retreating across the Eastern Front. Italy had surrendered and Allied forces were fighting their way up the Italian peninsula. The Atlantic U-boat campaign, which had nearly strangled Britain in 1942 and early 43, had been broken by improved Allied anti-submarine tactics and technology. The bombing campaign against German cities was intensifying, with the RAF attacking by night and the Americans by day. Within this context, Luftwaffe fighter pilots had convinced themselves that they were holding the line, that if they could just maintain the rate of attrition against American daylight bombers, they could preserve Germany's industrial capacity long enough for new wonder weapons to change the war's trajectory. The V-1 flying bomb was in final development. The V-2 ballistic missile was being prepared for operational deployment. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, which Luftwaffe test pilots reported was breathtakingly fast, would soon enter production. The appearance of the Mustang in strength destroyed this narrative. It made clear that American industrial and technological capability wasn't just matching Germany's, it was surpassing it. The United States had identified a critical operational problem, developed a solution, and deployed that solution in overwhelming numbers, all while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war across the Pacific and supporting Allied operations in Italy and preparing for the invasion of France. General Adolf Galland, watching the air war statistics with increasing alarm through March and April 1944, lobbied desperately for strategic changes. He argued for concentrating the Jagdwaffe against the American bombers and fighters, for withdrawing units from less critical sectors, for accelerating Me-262 production. In a meeting with Hermann Göring in late April, Galland presented detailed loss statistics and argued that the Luftwaffe was being bled white in a battle of attrition it couldn't win. Göring's response, recorded in Galland's memoir, was characteristic. He refused to acknowledge the scope of the problem, blamed the pilots for insufficient aggression, and insisted that German fighters were still superior to anything the Allies could field. When Galland specifically mentioned the P-51 and its impact, Göring dismissed it as defeatist exaggeration. But the pilots experiencing combat daily knew better. They could see the contrails of Mustangs high above, orbiting protectively around bomber formations. They could feel the difference when they tried to close with the bombers and found themselves immediately under attack from escorts that hadn't been there weeks before. They could count the empty chairs in the mess hall, the aircraft that didn't return from missions, the experienced leaders who were being killed faster than new pilots could be trained to replace them. Oberleutnant Heinz Noak's diary entries from April 1944 capture the growing desperation. On April 10, he wrote, 3 missions today. Lost 2 more pilots. The Americans seem to have unlimited numbers of fighters now. Every time we try to attack the bombers, we are bounced by P-51s. The escorts are everywhere. I don't know how we can continue like this. On April 19, shot down a B-17 but had to fight my way through 4 Mustangs to do it. Lost sight of my wingman in the combat. He did not return. That makes 8 pilots from my group lost this month. We cannot replace them fast enough. On April 29, the fuel situation is becoming critical. We are rationed to 1 practice flight per week. How can new pilots learn to fight when they can barely learn to fly? Meanwhile, the Americans practice every day, and their pilots are becoming better while ours, except for the few survivors, are becoming worse. The spring of 1944 marked what German fighter pilots would later call Die Krise, the crisis. It wasn't a single catastrophic defeat but rather a cascading series of tactical reverses that revealed the Luftwaffe's growing inability to defend German airspace against the combined weight of American industrial production and the P-51 Mustang's operational advantages. On May 8, 1944, the 8th Air Force dispatched over 900 heavy bombers to attack oil refineries and aircraft factories across Germany. The escort force included more than 700 fighters, with P-51s now comprising the majority. The Luftwaffe sent up every available fighter, over 300 aircraft from units across western Germany. Major Gunther Rall, leading elements of Jagdgeschwader 11, intercepted the bomber stream near Brunswick at approximately 13,000 meters altitude. His combat report from that day provides a detailed account of what fighting against comprehensive Mustang escort had become. At 10:45 hours, we sighted the enemy formation approaching from the northwest. Approximately 100 heavy bombers in combat box formation, with fighter escort visible above and to both sides of the bomber stream. I led my group in a climbing approach from the sun side, intending to make a single high-speed pass through the bomber formation before the escorts could react. As we reached attack altitude, I observed multiple groups of P-51 fighters already diving toward our position. They had seen us before we could begin our attack run. I called for the group to break and engage the fighters. What followed was a general engagement lasting approximately 12 minutes. The P-51 demonstrated superior performance in the climb and in sustained turning combat. Our 109s could match them in short bursts but could not maintain the pursuit. Multiple times I achieved firing position only to have the American aircraft outclimb me in a chandelle maneuver. I expended all ammunition in several deflection shots but observed no confirmed hits. 3 aircraft from my group were shot down. Lieutenant Hoffmann bailed out successfully. Feldwebel Kraus's aircraft was seen going down in flames, no parachute was observed. Unteroffizier Schmidt's aircraft was badly damaged, he attempted to reach our field but crashed on approach. We recovered his body from the wreckage. I claim no victories. We did not fire upon a single bomber. The mission was a complete failure. This pattern, Luftwaffe fighters being intercepted and engaged before they could reach the bombers, became increasingly common through May and into June. The fundamental tactical problem was insoluble. German fighters had to climb to intercept altitude, which took time and fuel and left them vulnerable to attack from Mustang formations already at altitude. American fighters could maintain altitude and speed while waiting for German formations to appear, giving them every advantage in the initial engagement. The few occasions when Luftwaffe fighters did penetrate the escort screen and reach the bombers, they found themselves fighting a two-front battle, trying to attack heavily defended bombers while simultaneously defending themselves from pursuing Mustangs. This divided attention reduced effectiveness and increased vulnerability. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock experienced this firsthand on May 12 during a mission against bombers targeting synthetic oil plants in central Germany. His diary entry captures the chaotic desperation of the engagement. We bounced a formation of B-24s at 12,000 meters. I selected a straggler trailing smoke from the No. 3 engine and made my approach from 7 o'clock high. Just as I opened fire, my wingman called out Mustangs above us. I broke hard right and saw tracers pass through the space I'd just occupied. What followed was the most intense combat I've experienced. There must have been 20 or 30 American fighters swarming around our group. Everywhere I looked, there were Mustangs. I could hear the radio calls, pilots calling for help, announcing they were hit, breaking off combat. The discipline we once maintained dissolved into individual survival. I got separated from my wingman and found myself alone with 3 P-51s on my tail. I dove for cloud cover, pushing my aircraft to its structural limits. The Americans followed. I could hear their rounds hitting my aircraft, thuds and crashes, metal tearing. My canopy shattered. Wind and noise filled the cockpit. I made it to the clouds and emerged at 6,000 meters, alone, with my engine trailing glycol on oil. I nursed the damaged 109 back to our emergency field at Paderborn. The crew chief counted 37 bullet holes in my aircraft. 3 more centimeters to the left on any of 5 separate hits, and I would have died. When I returned to the squadron that evening, we had lost 6 aircraft. 6 pilots. In one mission. And we didn't shoot down a single bomber. Not one. The psychological impact of repeated failures and mounting losses cannot be overstated. Luftwaffe fighter pilots had been conditioned to see themselves as elite warriors, the successors to the aces of the First World War, flying superior aircraft and employing superior tactics. This self-image was central to unit cohesion and individual motivation. The Mustang's systematic dominance shattered that identity. Pilot morale, already strained by years of continuous combat and mounting losses on all fronts, began to crack. Some pilots developed what flight surgeons called Kanalkrankheit, channel sickness, a psychosomatic condition characterized by nausea, vertigo, and anxiety attacks before missions. The condition's name originated during the Battle of Britain when some Luftwaffe pilots developed the symptoms before crossing the English Channel, but by mid-1944, it was appearing among pilots flying defensive missions over Germany itself. Others began seeking transfers to less dangerous assignments, night fighters, ground attack units, even infantry. Some simply stopped flying, claiming persistent medical conditions that medical examinations couldn't confirm or disprove. The Luftwaffe's personnel system, already strained by losses, began to experience systemic breakdown as experienced pilots sought any avenue to escape the meat grinder of daylight combat against American escorts. The veterans who remained grew increasingly bitter toward the German high command and toward Hermann Göring specifically. They could see the reality of the air war, that Germany was losing not because its pilots lacked courage or skill, but because they were systematically outnumbered, outproduced, and now outperformed by enemy equipment. Yet the official propaganda insisted that German equipment remained superior, that higher production was just months away, that new wonder weapons would transform the strategic situation. Adolf Galland, watching this deterioration from his position as general of fighters, became increasingly desperate and increasingly willing to confront his superiors with uncomfortable truths. In a meeting on May 17, 1944, Galland presented Göring and Field Marshal Erhard Milch with detailed statistics. In the first 2 weeks of May, the Jagdwaffe had lost 491 fighter aircraft over Germany, with 227 pilots killed and 143 wounded. During the same period, they had shot down approximately 120 American heavy bombers and 90 fighters. The exchange ratio had inverted catastrophically. Before the P-51 appeared in strength, the Luftwaffe could expect to destroy 3 to 4 American aircraft for every German fighter lost. Now they were losing 3 German fighters for every American aircraft destroyed. At this rate, the Jagdwaffe would cease to exist as an effective fighting force within months. Galland argued for 3 immediate measures. First, withdraw all single-engine fighters from secondary theaters and concentrate them for home defense. Second, implement Sturmgruppe tactics. Heavily armed and armored FW-190 formations would make mass frontal attacks against bomber formations, accepting heavy losses but inflicting crippling damage on the bomber stream. Third, accelerate Me-262 production and deploy the jet fighter in numbers sufficient to overwhelm American escorts with pure speed. Göring rejected the first proposal as defeatist, approved the second with reservations, and insisted that the Me-262 be modified for bomber rather than fighter operations, a decision that would delay its effective deployment and squander its potential. The Sturmgruppe concept represented a kind of tactical desperation, a tacit acknowledgement that conventional fighter versus fighter combat was no longer winnable. The plan called for heavily armed FW-190A8 aircraft, carrying additional armor protection and 4 20mm cannons plus 2 13mm machine guns. These aircraft would form into tight formations and make coordinated mass attacks against bomber formations, pressing home their attacks even in the face of defensive fire and escort fighters. The theory was that some aircraft would inevitably be shot down, but the survivors would inflict such devastating losses on the bomber stream that the Americans would be forced to suspend operations. It was, essentially, an admission that the Luftwaffe could no longer win through skill and tactics, only through accepting casualties that would have been considered unacceptable just months earlier. The first major Sturmgruppe operation occurred on July 7, 1944, during an American raid against synthetic oil plants in central Germany. Approximately 140 heavily armed FW-198s from Sturmgruppe formations attacked a bomber stream near Leipzig. They succeeded in shooting down 12 B-17 bombers, a respectable total. But they lost 51 aircraft in the process, with 39 pilots killed. The mathematics were simple and devastating. To destroy 12 bombers, the Luftwaffe had sacrificed 51 fighters and 39 pilots. The Americans lost 120 men killed or captured. The Germans lost 39 pilots, each of whom had months or years of training and combat experience that couldn't be replaced. The Americans could replace both aircraft and crews within weeks. The Germans could not. Worse, the Sturmgruppe tactics worked only when they could reach the bombers before being intercepted by escorts. Against comprehensive P-51 coverage, the heavily laden, relatively slow Sturmgruppe formations were vulnerable to slashing attacks from above. Mustang pilots quickly learned to identify the heavily armed formations and prioritize them for attack, further reducing their effectiveness. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By summer 1944, individual Luftwaffe pilots were developing their own informal assessments of the P-51 and how to survive encounters with it. These assessments, passed between pilots in ready rooms and captured in diaries and post-war interviews, reveal a grudging respect mixed with frustration and fear. Hauptmann Hans Hartigs, flying with Jägerschwader 3, survived 132 combat missions before being killed in November 1944. In a letter to his brother dated August 2, 1944, he wrote, "The Mustang is the most dangerous opponent I have faced. It is faster than our 109 at altitude, climbs better, turns equally well, and has fuel to fight for 30 minutes or more over German territory before returning home. The only advantage we maintain is in the initial dive. If we can catch them by surprise from above, we can build speed in the dive that they cannot match. But they are rarely surprised anymore. Their formations maintain excellent discipline, with high cover watching for exactly this type of attack. My advice to new pilots is simple: do not engage P-51s unless you have every possible advantage, altitude, sun position, numerical superiority, and an escape route planned. If you find yourself in a turning fight with a Mustang at altitude, you will likely lose. If you must fight, use your aircraft's roll rate. The 109 rolls faster than the Mustang in high-speed flight. Make your pass, roll inverted, pull through, and dive away. Do not try to turn with them. Do not try to climb with them. And do not believe anyone who tells you our aircraft are superior. They are not. Not anymore." This assessment, brutally honest and tactically sound, reflected what the most experienced Luftwaffe pilots had learned through bitter experience. But such knowledge came too late and reached too few pilots to make a strategic difference. The fundamental problem was that by mid-1944, the Luftwaffe's training system had collapsed under the weight of fuel shortages, instructor losses, and compressed training schedules. New pilots were being sent to combat units with dangerously inadequate preparation, often with less than 100 hours total flight time and minimal gunnery training. These inexperienced pilots, thrust into combat against increasingly skilled American pilots flying superior aircraft, died in appalling numbers. The experienced pilots who might have mentored them were either dead or too few in number to provide adequate guidance. Unit cohesion, which depends on trust and mutual support developed through training and shared experience, disintegrated. Individual survival took precedence over unit effectiveness. Heinz Noakes' diary entry from September 3, 1944, captures this deterioration. Received 3 replacement pilots today. Boys, really? The oldest is 20 years old. They have flown the 109 for perhaps 15 hours each. I took them up for a practice flight, basic formation keeping, simple turns. They could barely maintain position. One nearly collided with me during a gentle turn. I tried to explain the basics of combat, how to watch for fighters, how to maintain situational awareness, basic evasion techniques. They listened with wide eyes, terrified. I don't think anything I said registered. They are simply not prepared for what they will face. Tomorrow we fly a mission against American bombers. These boys will be flying in it. I give them perhaps 1 chance in 3 of surviving their first combat. If they survive that, their odds improve slightly. But most won't survive. I see it in their faces, they know it too. This is what we've come to. Sending children to die in aircraft they barely know how to fly, against enemies who are better trained, better equipped, and more numerous. It is murder, really. Murder disguised as military necessity. The September mission Noak referenced was typical of the period. His group intercepted a bomber formation near Frankfurt, escorted by what Noak estimated as over 100 P-51s. In the engagement that followed, all 3 replacement pilots were shot down. None survived. The statistical record confirms Noak's grim assessment. In the month of September 1944 alone, the Jagdwaffe lost over 750 fighters in combat over Germany and occupied territories. Approximately 400 pilots were killed, with another 250 wounded or missing. The replacement pipeline delivered approximately 500 new pilots that month, almost exactly enough to replace the losses, but with pilots whose average skill level was a fraction of those they were replacing. Meanwhile, American pilot quality continued to improve. By late 1944, USAF fighter pilots were receiving approximately 240 hours of training before entering combat, with significant emphasis on combat tactics, gunnery, and formation flying. They benefited from standardized training curricula developed from combat experience, from gun camera footage analysis, and from debriefs with returning pilots. The P-51 squadrons had developed sophisticated tactics specifically designed to exploit the Mustang's advantages while minimizing exposure to its few weaknesses. They flew in mutually supporting elements, maintaining altitude advantage when possible, using speed and climb rate to disengage from unfavorable situations, and coordinating attacks to overwhelm German formations with numbers and positioning. One particularly effective tactic was what American pilots called bouncing the climb. Luftwaffe fighters typically vectored toward incoming bomber streams from their forward airfields, climbing to interception altitude while trying to position themselves for attack. P-51 formations would orbit at high altitude, watching for these climbing German formations, then dive on them with tremendous speed advantage, disrupting the German formation before they could reach attack altitude. Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group and one of the most successful American fighter leaders in Europe, described the tactic in a post-war interview. We learned quickly that the German fighters had to climb to get at the bombers. That climb took time and fuel, and it left them vulnerable. We'd maintain formation at 28 or 30,000 feet, watching the contrails below. When we spotted a German group climbing, we'd drop down on them with every bit of speed we could build up. The impact of that first pass was devastating. The Germans would be in their climb formation, relatively close together, focused on reaching altitude, not expecting attack from above. We'd blow through them at maybe 500 miles per hour, and before they knew what hit them, we'd have knocked down 3 or 4 aircraft and scattered the rest. The survivors would have to reform and try again, but now they were lower, they'd burn fuel, and they knew we were there. Most of the time, they'd give up and head home. And we'd never have let them near the bombers. This tactical approach, using the P-51's performance to dominate the vertical dimension of combat, was exactly the type of fighting the Luftwaffe had practiced to perfection in earlier years. Now the same tactics were being used against German pilots with devastating effectiveness. By October 1944, the Luftwaffe's situation had deteriorated from crisis to catastrophe. Fuel production, targeted relentlessly by American bombers, had collapsed from approximately 180,000 tons per month in April to less than 20,000 tons in October. This meant not only reduced combat sorties but also severely curtailed training flights. On October 7, Adolf Galland met with Hermann Göring and presented what he later described as the most pessimistic assessment he'd ever given. The Jagdwaffe, Galland reported, was effectively defeated as a strategic force. It could still mount occasional operations with concentrated forces, but it could no longer contest American air superiority over Germany in any sustained way. The numbers told the story. In the 6 months from April through September 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost over 3,800 single-engine fighters in combat. Approximately 2,000 pilots had been killed, with another 1,000 wounded seriously enough to remove them from combat status. During the same period, American losses were roughly 1,300 fighters with approximately 800 pilots killed or missing. The Luftwaffe had fought itself into exhaustion and numerical irrelevance. By November 1944, the 8th Air Force could dispatch over 1,000 heavy bombers with over 700 fighter escorts, and the Luftwaffe could typically respond with fewer than 200 fighters. The numerical disparity, combined with the qualitative advantage of the P-51, meant that American bombers could now attack virtually any target in Germany with near impunity. The psychological impact on the remaining Luftwaffe pilots was profound. Men who had begun the war with confidence in German superiority, who had experienced victory after victory in the early campaigns, now faced a daily reality of overwhelming enemy strength, inadequate fuel and ammunition, deteriorating aircraft maintenance, and leadership that seemed disconnected from the actual conditions of combat. Johannes Steinhoff, who had survived the war despite being badly burned in a jet fighter crash in April 1945, later reflected on this period. By late 1944, we knew the war was lost. We could see it in the numbers, in the contrails filling the sky with American aircraft, in the empty beds in our quarters, in the boys being sent to us as replacement pilots. But we kept flying because it was our duty, because our comrades were still flying, because stopping felt like betrayal. But the Mustang, the P-51, that aircraft represented everything we'd lost. It was better than our fighters. It had the range we'd been told was impossible. It was being produced in numbers we couldn't match. And it was flown by pilots who were often just as skilled as we were, sometimes more so. Every time we climbed into our aircraft for a mission, we knew we would face Mustangs. And we knew that in any engagement with a competent Mustang pilot, the odds were against us. That knowledge, that certainty of inferiority, was psychologically devastating. It destroyed morale in a way that no amount of propaganda could repair. The final months of 1944 saw the Luftwaffe reduced to what historian Williamson Murray would later call a force in being without the capability to act. Fighter units existed on paper, but many were at a fraction of their authorized strength. Some units had aircraft but no fuel. Others had fuel but no pilots. Still others had both but lacked ammunition, spare parts, or functioning radios. On December 17, 1944, the Luftwaffe attempted one final major operation against American air power, Operation Bodenplatte, a mass attack against Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland timed to support the Ardennes offensive. Nearly 1,000 Luftwaffe fighters participated in what would be the largest single-day German air operation since 1940. The operation achieved tactical surprise and destroyed or damaged over 300 Allied aircraft on the ground. But the Luftwaffe lost approximately 280 aircraft, with over 200 pilots killed or captured. Many of these pilots were experienced flight leaders and unit commanders, irreplaceable losses that the Jagdwaffe could not sustain. The units that participated in Bodenplatte were so badly mauled that many never recovered operational effectiveness. And the P-51, which had not been caught on the ground in significant numbers, continued to dominate the skies. Within days of Bodenplatte, Mustang squadrons were back at full strength, flying escort for bombers, conducting ground attack missions, and maintaining air superiority over the battlefield. Heinz Noak's final diary entry regarding combat with P-51s was dated January 18, 1945. Flew what I expect will be my last mission today. We intercepted bombers near Magdeburg. 30 P-51s were waiting for us. I saw 2 of my wingmen go down in the first pass. I managed to evade and dove for the deck. My aircraft was hit multiple times. I crash-landed in a field near our lines. I am done. I cannot do this anymore. In the past year, I have seen my group destroyed 3 times over. I have lost count of the friends and comrades who have died. And for what? We change nothing. The bombers keep coming. The Mustangs keep coming. Germany is burning, and we are powerless to stop it. The P-51 defeated us. Not because we lacked courage. Not because we were poor pilots. But because they built a better aircraft, produced it in overwhelming numbers, and flew it with skill and determination. We fought as well as we could, but it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Noak survived the war, but many of his contemporaries did not. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the WWII had lost over 18,000 aircraft and approximately 11,000 pilots since the beginning of 1944. The P-51 Mustang hadn't caused all those losses, but it had been the primary instrument of the Luftwaffe's destruction in the critical period when German fighter strength could still have made a strategic difference. The final 4 months of the war in Europe, from January to May 1945, witnessed the complete disintegration of organized Luftwaffe resistance. But understanding what Luftwaffe pilots truly thought about the P-51 Mustang requires looking beyond combat statistics and operational reports to the personal testimonies, post-war interviews, and memoirs of the men who survived. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence teams conducted extensive debriefing operations with captured Luftwaffe pilots and commanders. These interrogations, initially focused on tactical and technical intelligence, gradually expanded to include broader assessments of Allied equipment, tactics, and the psychological factors that had contributed to German defeat. The interrogation reports, declassified decades later, reveal a consistent pattern in Luftwaffe pilots' assessments of the P-51. Unlike their evaluations of other Allied aircraft, where German pilots often emphasized specific weaknesses or tactical vulnerabilities they had learned to exploit, their comments about the Mustang centered on its comprehensive superiority and the absence of exploitable flaws. Major Gunther Rall, interrogated by American intelligence officers in June 1945, provided what would become one of the most frequently cited assessments. The P-51 was the best all-around fighter aircraft of the war. I say this as someone who flew against every major Allied fighter type. The Spitfire was magnificent, but it lacked range. The Thunderbolt was tough and powerful, but less maneuverable. The Lightning was fast, but had weaknesses in turning combat. The Mustang had no significant weakness that we could identify and exploit. It could fight us on equal terms or better at any altitude. It could outrun us, outclimb us, and outturn us in most situations. Most importantly, it could escort the bombers all the way to any target in Germany and still have fuel to fight. That capability, more than anything else, defeated the Luftwaffe. We could no longer isolate the bombers. Every engagement became a fight against fighters that were our equal or better, and there were always more of them than there were of us. Rall's assessment emphasized the operational strategic dimension, that the Mustang's range capability had fundamentally altered the nature of the air war. But other pilots focused more directly on the aircraft's flying characteristics and what it was like to face in combat. Colonel Johannes Steinhoff, interviewed extensively in the 1960s and 70s for various historical projects, provided detailed technical comparisons. Against the Mustang, our standard tactics didn't work. We had learned to fight the Thunderbolt by avoiding prolonged turning engagements and using superior climb rate to regain altitude advantage. Against the Spitfire, we could use our superior high-altitude performance and better diving characteristics. The Mustang gave us no such options. If a competent Mustang pilot had altitude advantage, he could dictate the engagement. He could dive on us with superior speed, make a firing pass, and climb away faster than we could follow. If we tried to run, the Mustang was faster in level flight. If we tried to climb away, the Mustang climbed better. Our only hope was to spot them first and attack from a superior position, but by late 1944, they were usually at higher altitude, they had more aircraft, and they were actively hunting for us. The psychological effect was significant. In earlier years, we could study an enemy aircraft's characteristics and develop tactics to exploit its weaknesses. Every aircraft has compromises: speed versus maneuverability, altitude performance versus low-level handling, range versus firepower. The Mustang seemed to have no significant compromises. It was fast, maneuverable, had excellent altitude performance, tremendous range, and adequate firepower. Fighting it felt like playing chess against an opponent who had extra pieces. This chess analogy appeared repeatedly in post-war German accounts, the sense that the Mustang had fundamentally altered the rules of air combat in ways that made traditional tactical approaches obsolete. But perhaps the most psychologically revealing testimonies came from pilots who had initially refused to accept the P-51's superiority and had learned through painful experience that their preconceptions were wrong. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, who survived the war and published his wartime diary in 1953, reflected extensively on his evolving understanding of the Mustang. When we first encountered the P-51 in early 1944, I didn't believe the reports about its performance. I thought pilots were exaggerating, making excuses for their failures. I believed our 109 was still superior, that German pilots were still better trained, that we would adapt and overcome as we had against every previous threat. My first direct engagement with Mustangs changed my mind immediately. I was flying at my aircraft's maximum performance, as fast, as high, as aggressively as the 109 could manage, and the Mustang pilot was matching me effortlessly. Not struggling, not pushing his aircraft to its limits, but flying smoothly, confidently, always in position to attack. I got away that day through luck and cloud cover, not skill. And I realized that everything I'd believed about German air superiority was wrong. We didn't have better aircraft. We didn't have better training anymore. We were losing, and the Mustang was the clearest evidence that we had lost the technological and industrial competition that ultimately decides modern wars. Nock's testimony captures a broader theme in Luftwaffe pilots' post-war reflections. The Mustang represented not just a superior aircraft but proof of American industrial and organizational capability that Germany simply couldn't match. The psychological impact of this realization extended far beyond tactical considerations. For pilots who had been raised on narratives of German technical superiority and Aryan racial supremacy, the appearance of an American fighter that was comprehensively better than anything Germany could produce represented a cognitive crisis. The propaganda they'd been fed, about decadent democracies unable to match German engineering, about racially inferior Americans incapable of military excellence, collapsed in the face of daily evidence to the contrary. Hauptmann Hans-Eckhard Bob, who survived 212 combat missions and was shot down twice by P-51s, described this psychological dissonance in a 1980s interview. We had been told the Americans were soft, that they lacked fighting spirit, that their democracy and materialism made them weak. Then we encountered their pilots in the Mustang, and they fought with skill, courage, and determination. They had better aircraft, better tactics, better support. Everything we'd been told was a lie. The Mustang itself was evidence of this. It was an engineering masterpiece, efficient, elegant, effective. It wasn't crude or simple. It was sophisticated, well-designed, and manufactured to extremely high standards. We could see this when we examined captured examples. The Americans hadn't won through brute force alone. They'd won through superior design, superior production, and superior operational employment. Accepting this truth required abandoning much of what we'd believed about the war and about Germany's place in the world. Many pilots couldn't make that psychological adjustment. They blamed fuel shortages, blamed leadership, blamed anything except the fundamental reality that we had been defeated by a better air force flying better aircraft. The examination of captured P-51s provided German engineers and pilots with detailed evidence of American manufacturing quality and design sophistication. Several intact Mustangs had been captured or had force-landed in German-controlled territory through 1944. These aircraft were extensively studied at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary test facility. The technical reports from these examinations, preserved in captured German documents, revealed German engineers' grudging admiration for the Mustang's design. They noted the efficient laminar flow wing, which reduced drag and increased range. They analyzed the cooling system, which managed to keep the Merlin engine at operating temperature while minimizing drag, a problem German designers had struggled with. They examined the manufacturing quality, noting the precision of assembly and the quality of materials used. One German engineer's report, dated March 1944, concluded, "The P-51 represents the current state-of-the-art in single-engine fighter design. Its performance characteristics exceed our Bf-109G and match or exceed our FW-190A in most regimes. The range performance is particularly notable and represents a design philosophy different from our own. Where we have prioritized maximum performance for short duration, the Americans have achieved excellent performance combined with extended range. This combination gives them a decisive operational advantage." This technical assessment confirmed what Luftwaffe pilots had been reporting from combat. The Mustang wasn't just incrementally better, it represented a different design philosophy and a different strategic approach to air warfare. By early 1945, with Germany's defeat increasingly certain, some Luftwaffe units began receiving the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The 262 was dramatically faster than any Allied aircraft, capable of speeds approaching 870 km per hour. It represented the technological breakthrough that German propaganda had promised would change the war's course. The pilots who transitioned to the Me-262 and flew it in combat against Allied aircraft, including the P-51, provided unique comparative perspectives. They had experienced both defeat in conventional fighters and the exhilaration of flying an aircraft with overwhelming speed advantage. Major Walter Nauetny, one of the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring aces with 258 confirmed victories, commanded the first operational jet fighter unit, Commando Nauetny, in late 1944. Before his death in combat on November 8, 1944, he wrote a detailed assessment of the Me-262's capabilities and limitations. "The 262 gives us back the speed advantage we lost to the Mustang. We can engage at will and disengage at will. No Allied fighter can catch us when we want to leave. This is a tremendous tactical advantage. However, the jet is not a simple solution to our problems. It is difficult to fly, requires extensive pilot training, and is vulnerable during takeoff and landing when it cannot use its speed advantage. The Mustangs have learned to patrol our jet bases and attack us when we are most vulnerable. More fundamentally, we don't have enough jets. We don't have enough fuel. We don't have enough experienced pilots to fly them. The 262 is a magnificent aircraft, but it has arrived too late and in too small numbers to change the strategic situation. The Americans continue to bomb our factories, our fuel plants, our cities. And the Mustangs continue to escort them, and we cannot stop them." Nauetny was killed less than 2 weeks after writing this assessment, shot down during a mission against B-17 bombers. The circumstances of his death remain debated. Some accounts suggest mechanical failure, others suggest he was shot down by P-51 escorts, but his death symbolized the futility of Germany's late-war technological efforts. Even with superior equipment, the Luftwaffe could no longer reverse the tide of the air war. The pilots who survived the transition to jets and flew combat missions through the war's final weeks universally acknowledged that while the Me-262 could defeat the P-51 in a straight-line speed engagement, it couldn't change the strategic situation. There were too few jets, too few trained pilots, too little fuel, and too much American air power for any single weapon system to make a decisive difference. Lieutenant Franz Stigler, who flew both conventional fighters and jets in the war's final months, later reflected, "We hoped the jets would save us, would give us back air superiority. But hope isn't strategy." The Me-262 was wonderful to fly, truly revolutionary, but it didn't change the fundamental problem. The Americans had hundreds of P-51s. We had dozens of 262s. They could replace losses overnight. We couldn't replace anything. Even when we did achieve success, when I shot down a B-17 with the jet, it felt hollow. One bomber out of a formation of hundreds. And tomorrow there would be more bombers, more Mustangs, and probably fewer of us. The mathematics of the air war had become so lopsided that individual victories were meaningless. This sense of futility, of fighting a battle already lost, pervades the late war accounts of Luftwaffe pilots. They continued flying not because they believed they could win, but out of duty, loyalty to comrades, and sometimes simple fatalism. In the war's final days, as Soviet forces closed on Berlin from the east and American and British forces advanced from the west, the Luftwaffe essentially ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Some units surrendered intact to the Western Allies. Others fought until their aircraft were destroyed or fuel ran out. Individual pilots made their own decisions about whether to continue fighting, where to surrender, or whether to attempt to escape to neutral countries. The psychological toll on these men, who had begun the war with confidence and pride, who had experienced years of victories, who had gradually watched their air force broken by an enemy they had been taught to despise, was profound and lasting. Post-war studies of Luftwaffe veterans revealed high rates of what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and survivor's guilt. Many struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, haunted by memories of comrades killed, by the destruction they had witnessed, and by the cognitive dissonance between what they had believed and what they had experienced. In the 1960s and 70s, as historians began conducting systematic interviews with surviving Luftwaffe pilots, a more nuanced picture of their wartime experiences and attitudes emerged. When asked specifically about the P-51 Mustang, their responses typically combined professional respect for the aircraft's capabilities with bitter resentment about what it represented. Adolf Galland, who survived the war and became a successful businessman, wrote extensively about the air war in his 1954 memoir The First and the Last. His assessment of the P-51 was characteristically direct. The P-51 Mustang was the most decisive weapon introduced in the European air war. Not because it was invincible, no aircraft is invincible, but because it solved the fundamental strategic problem that had protected Germany's industries, fighter escort range. Once the Mustang appeared in numbers, we could no longer attack the bombers without fighting through their escorts. And their escorts, flying excellent aircraft and well-trained, increasingly defeated us. I do not begrudge the Americans their victory. They designed better aircraft, they produced them in greater numbers, they trained their pilots well, and they employed their air power intelligently. They deserve to win. But I regret that German leadership failed to recognize the strategic threat earlier and failed to respond effectively. We knew by spring 1944 that the Mustang had changed everything. We should have immediately concentrated all available forces for home defense, accelerated jet production, and husbanded our experienced pilots. Instead, we dispersed our strength, wasted resources on irrelevant prestige projects, and threw inexperienced boys into combat where they died uselessly. The Mustang didn't defeat the Luftwaffe alone. But it was the instrument of our defeat, wielded by capable hands, at the critical moment when we might still have made a difference. Galland's analysis, written less than a decade after the war's end, reflects both his professional understanding of the strategic situation and his frustration with German leadership's failure to respond effectively. This frustration, directed not at American pilots or the Mustang itself, but at German commanders who failed to adapt, appears repeatedly in veterans' accounts. The personal relationships that developed between former enemies in the post-war years added another dimension to these reflections. Fighter pilots, regardless of nationality, shared common experiences and mutual respect born of combat. Beginning in the 1970s, veterans organizations began arranging meetings between former adversaries, allowing German and American pilots to discuss their wartime experiences openly. These encounters, often emotionally charged, revealed that pilots on both sides had harbored misconceptions about their opponents. American pilots had sometimes believed the propaganda about Nazi fanaticism and had expected their German opponents to be ideologically driven zealots. German pilots had believed American flyers would be less skilled, less aggressive, less determined. the reality that emerged from these conversations was more complex and more human. Most pilots on both sides had been professional military men doing their duty as they understood it, flying and fighting with whatever skill and courage they could muster, trying to survive while accomplishing their missions. Franz Stigler, the Luftwaffe pilot who famously spared a badly damaged B-17 bomber in December 1943, an incident that became the subject of the book A Higher Call, later developed a close friendship with the American pilot he had spared, Charles Brown. In discussing his wartime experiences, Stigler often reflected on the P-51. When I flew against the Mustang, I wasn't thinking about politics or ideology. I was thinking about survival, about tactics, about getting my wingman home safely. The Mustang was a problem to be solved, a threat to be evaded or defeated if possible. Only later, after the war, did I understand the full significance of that aircraft. It represented American industrial power, American engineering capability, American determination to win. It proved that everything we'd been told about our enemies was wrong. They weren't inferior. They weren't weak. They were formidable, and they defeated us decisively. There's no shame in being defeated by a superior force. The shame lies in refusing to acknowledge that superiority, in clinging to delusions of supremacy that evidence contradicts. The Mustang forced us to confront reality. For some pilots, that confrontation was psychologically devastating. For others, myself included, it was eventually liberating. The truth, however painful, is better than living in a false narrative. This emphasis on truth versus propaganda, on reality versus ideology, appears consistently in the reflections of thoughtful veterans. The P-51, more than any other single weapon system, had provided undeniable empirical evidence that contradicted Nazi ideology's claims about racial superiority and democratic weakness. The technical aviation community, German engineers and test pilots who had evaluated Allied equipment after the war, provided additional perspective. These men, trained to assess aircraft objectively based on measurable performance characteristics, universally acknowledged the P-51's excellence. Hans Werner Lurk, chief test pilot at Rechlin who flew captured Allied aircraft during the war and later worked with the U.S. Air Force, wrote in his memoir, "As a test pilot, I evaluated every major fighter aircraft of World War II. I flew the Spitfire, the Thunderbolt, the Lightning, the Mustang, the Tempest, and others alongside our German types. My assessment, based purely on performance and handling characteristics, is that the P-51D with the Packard Merlin was the finest all-around fighter of the war. It combined excellent speed with good maneuverability. It had outstanding range. The visibility from the bubble canopy was superior to most other fighters. The controls were well harmonized and effective at all speeds. The aircraft was stable as a gun platform but responsive to control inputs. It was, in short, a pilot's aircraft, well-designed, well-built, and effective." German designers learned from studying the Mustang. The emphasis on aerodynamic efficiency, the attention to cooling system design, the integration of drop tanks as standard equipment rather than afterthought, these became design principles for post-war aircraft development. The Mustang influenced fighter design for decades after the war. This technical legacy, the lessons learned from the P-51's design that influenced subsequent fighter development, represents another dimension of the aircraft's impact. German engineers who went to work for the United States, Soviet Union, and other countries after the war carried with them detailed knowledge of what made the Mustang effective. These lessons informed the next generation of fighter aircraft design globally. The broader historical assessment that emerged in the decades after the war consistently identified the P-51 Mustang as one of the most significant weapons of World War II, not because it was the fastest or most heavily armed, but because it appeared at the critical moment and solved the critical problem that had protected German industry from systematic destruction. Military historians analyzing the combined bomber offensive, the coordinated British and American strategic bombing campaign against Germany, universally acknowledged that the campaign's effectiveness increased dramatically after the P-51 achieved operational readiness in significant numbers. Before the Mustang provided comprehensive escort, bomber loss rates were approaching the unsustainable threshold that might have forced suspension of daylight operations. After the Mustang's deployment, loss rates declined while target destruction increased. The oil campaign of mid-1944, which destroyed Germany's synthetic fuel production and crippled military mobility, would have been impossible without long-range fighter escort. The transportation campaign that systematically destroyed Germany's rail network, preventing movement of troops and supplies, required the ability to attack targets deep in Germany without prohibitive losses. The direct attacks on German aircraft production facilities required fighting through concentrated fighter defenses, possible only with comprehensive escort. All of these campaigns depended on the P-51's capability to escort bombers throughout their missions while maintaining sufficient performance to defeat German interceptors. Remove the Mustang from the equation, and the strategic air campaign against Germany becomes either impossible or so costly that its continuation becomes questionable. This strategic significance, the role of one aircraft in enabling an entire dimension of Allied strategy, explains why Luftwaffe pilots' assessments of the P-51 often transcended simple technical evaluation to encompass broader reflections on the war's outcome. The final word, perhaps, should come from Gunther Rall, who survived the war as the third highest scoring fighter ace in history and who lived until 2009. Long enough to see multiple generations of historical analysis and to reflect extensively on his wartime experiences. In a 2004 interview, asked directly what he thought about the P-51 Mustang, he replied, "The Mustang was the aircraft that beat us. Not alone, but it was the decisive weapon. I say this not to diminish the courage of our pilots or to excuse our defeat, but simply as a statement of historical fact. The Mustang gave the Americans the capability they needed at the moment they needed it. They used that capability intelligently and effectively. We couldn't counter it because we lacked the resources, the fuel, the production capacity, and ultimately the time. When people ask me about the air war, about how Germany lost air superiority, I tell them to study the P-51. Not because it was perfect, no machine is perfect, but because it represented the application of engineering excellence, industrial capability, and strategic vision to a critical military problem. The Americans identified what they needed, they designed it, they built it in huge numbers, and they used it to win. That's how wars are won. We fought as well as we could with what we had. But what we had wasn't enough. The Mustang proved that, mission after mission, combat after combat, until there was nothing left of the Luftwaffe but scattered remnants and the memories of better days. It's a bitter thing to acknowledge defeat, but it's also necessary. The Mustang defeated us. We should have the honesty to say so. This acknowledgement, direct, unsentimental, factual, captures the essence of what Luftwaffe pilots really thought about the P-51 Mustang. It was the aircraft that proved German air superiority was a myth, that demonstrated American industrial and technical capability, that enabled the strategic bombing campaign that devastated German war production, and that ultimately broke the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. The men who flew against it, who survived the war and lived to reflect on their experiences, came to recognize the Mustang not just as a superior weapons system but as a symbol of why Germany lost the war. In the contest between totalitarian ideology and democratic industrial power, between propaganda and reality, between what Germany claimed to be and what America proved itself capable of becoming, the P-51 Mustang represented the triumph of capability over rhetoric, of evidence over belief, of material reality over ideological fantasy. The Luftwaffe pilots who faced the Mustang in combat learned these lessons at terrible cost. Many didn't survive to share what they had learned. Those who did survive carried with them memories of a specific aircraft, sleek, silver, deadly, and seemingly everywhere, that represented the end of German air power and the beginning of their understanding that the war they had been fighting was already lost. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.